I stood there, staring at the papers in front of me, the documents that would secure our future together. My wife, Sophia, smiled across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. She looked perfect, as she always did. Too perfect, maybe. I never imagined I'd find someone like you, she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of sincerity that could melt the coldest heart. And just like that, I signed the papers. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't let her think I didn't trust her. After all, wasn't trust what our marriage was built on? But even as I signed my name, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "Something isn't right." We'd met 2 years earlier, at a friend's party. Sophia had walked in wearing a stunning black dress, her smile lighting up the room. She was magnetic. Every word she said, every move she made, pulled me closer to her. Within weeks, we were inseparable. She seemed perfect. Funny, supportive, and endlessly kind. Whenever I doubted myself, she'd lean in, touch my arm, and say, "You're amazing. Don't forget that." But now, looking back, I couldn't help but wonder if all those perfect moments were calculated. Our wedding had been beautiful, small, intimate, and exactly what I thought we both wanted. But there were little moments that stood out to me now. The way she'd insisted on managing every detail, especially the finances. How she'd gently dismissed my suggestion of a prenuptial agreement, saying, "We don't need something like that. We're partners, right?" At the time, her words felt like a testament to her love for me. Now, they felt like a warning I'd ignored. Shortly after we got married, my life changed forever. My father passed away, leaving me an inheritance that was larger than anything I'd ever imagined. Sophia seemed supportive at first. She held my hand at the reading of the will, whispered comforting words when I broke down in grief, and promised we'd use the money to honor my father's memory. But then, things started to shift. Sophia began talking more about our future and less about my family's legacy. She suggested joint accounts, saying it was just easier. And she became increasingly distant whenever I brought up my plans to invest some of the money into charities my father cared about. One evening, I walked into the living room to find her on the phone. She quickly ended the call when she saw me, her face flushed. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just a friend," she said quickly, her smile a little too wide. "Nothing important." It didn't feel like nothing. And then there was the time I overheard her talking to someone late at night. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but I caught the words, "He's so trusting. This is going to be easier than I thought." My stomach twisted. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but a part of me held back. Maybe I misheard. Maybe I'm overthinking. As the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started noticing little things. She'd always leave the room when taking certain phone calls. Documents related to my inheritance, which I'd left in my office, suddenly disappeared. And she started asking more questions about my accounts, always framing it as concern for our future. Still, I told myself it was just her way of being involved. She's my wife. She loves me. Right? But the moment that made my heart drop came when I found a document on her laptop, a transfer form for a significant portion of my inheritance, with her name as the sole recipient. The file name was simple: Inheritance Plan. My hands shook as I scrolled through it, the truth becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't love. This wasn't a partnership. This was a scheme. I closed the laptop, my heart pounding. Sophia walked into the room a moment later, her smile as dazzling as ever. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head in that way she knew always softened me. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, everything's fine." But inside, my world was crumbling. If she thought I was going to let her steal everything my family built, she had another thing coming. The next few days were a blur of suspicion and quiet observation. I couldn't confront Sophia yet. I needed to be sure, to gather proof. Every smile she gave me, every affectionate touch, felt like a dagger, a reminder of the lies hiding behind her perfect facade. The weight of what I'd found on her laptop pressed on me, but I kept my expression neutral, my voice steady. If she noticed my unease, she didn't let it show. Sophia's behavior, however, became increasingly suspicious. One morning, I mentioned wanting to review our joint account for some upcoming expenses, and her response was immediate. "Don't worry about that," she said quickly, brushing it off. "I've already taken care of everything. You should focus on work." Let me handle the boring stuff." She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I nodded, playing along, but the alarm bells in my head were deafening. Later that evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I casually brought up the idea of meeting with a financial advisor. "I think it might be a good idea to get a professional's opinion on how to manage the inheritance," I said, keeping my tone light. Sophia froze for a fraction of a second, so quick it would have been easy to miss, but I saw it. "Do you really think we need that?" she asked, her voice overly casual. "I mean, we're doing fine on our own, aren't we?" I shrugged. "Just a thought," I said, letting the topic drop, but her reaction only confirmed my suspicions. That night, I waited until she was asleep. Then, quietly, I retrieved her laptop from the desk and my heart raced as I opened it, every click of the keys feeling louder than it was. The file I'd found before was gone, but the browser history told its own story. Searches for terms like transfer of ownership, inheritance loopholes, and even, can a spouse claim assets in a divorce? My hands trembled as I scrolled through the evidence. She wasn't just planning to take the money, she was planning to leave me too. I returned the laptop to its place and sat in the dark, my mind racing. The betrayal felt suffocating, but more than that, I felt stupid. How had I not seen this coming? How could I have been so blind? I thought about my father, about how proud he'd been of the life he'd built for our family, and my resolve hardened. I couldn't let Sophia destroy everything my family had worked for. If she wanted to play games, then I would play to win. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I told him everything, sparing no detail, and he listened patiently. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "But if we're going to protect your assets, we need to act fast. Do you have access to all your financial records?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me over the phone. "I'll get everything together," I said. "Whatever it takes." He outlined the steps we'd need to take, freezing accounts, updating documents, and creating a legal trail to prove her intentions. It would be a battle, but I was ready. Over the next few days, I started putting the plan into motion. Quietly, I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, emails, receipts, and screenshots of her searches. I also began moving funds out of our joint account, leaving just enough to avoid raising suspicion. All the while, I acted as though nothing had changed. I smiled at Sophia, laughed at her jokes, and kissed her goodnight. Even as the weight of her betrayal pressed on me, I felt like a stranger in my own life, but it was necessary. She couldn't know what was coming. The final straw came when I overheard her on the phone again, her voice low but clear. "It's almost done," she said. "Once the transfer goes through, I'll be out of here. He won't know what hit him." My hands clenched into fists as I listened, but I forced myself to stay calm. The endgame was approaching, and I needed to be ready. I knew I couldn't keep playing along much longer. Every passing moment felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the moment Sophia would try to execute her plan. But I was ready. My lawyer had worked quickly, putting protections in place to secure my inheritance and create a paper trail that would make her schemes impossible to deny. All I needed now was for her to make the first move. One evening, Sophia came to me with a bright smile, holding a stack of documents. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice as sweet as honey. "It would be so much easier if we consolidated everything into one account. Simplify things." She slid the papers across the table toward me. "It's just a transfer form, nothing complicated. I already signed it, see?" She pointed to her neat signature at the bottom of the page. I looked down at the papers, my stomach churning. This was it, the moment she'd been working toward, but I kept my expression neutral, nodding as though I saw nothing wrong. "You've really thought of everything," I said, forcing a smile. Her eyes lit up, the faintest glint of triumph flashing across her face. "I just want to make things easier for us," she said. "I'll look it over later," I replied, carefully setting the papers aside. Her smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. No rush." That night, after she went to bed, I examined the documents more closely. They were exactly what I'd expected, a request to transfer the majority of my inheritance into an account solely under her name. She'd even gone so far as to backdate some of the forms, making it appear as though we'd discussed this plan months earlier. My hands shook with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could someone I'd loved and trusted be so calculating, so cold? The next day, I made my move. I went to the bank with the documents, but instead of signing them, I handed them to my lawyer, who was waiting for me. Together, we filed the necessary paperwork to freeze the joint account and secure my assets under new protections. Sophia wouldn't be able to access a single cent without my knowledge. Later that evening, I sat in the living room, pretending to read while Sophia paced back and forth, her phone clutched in her hand. She was clearly agitated, muttering under her breath about delays and complications. "Is everything okay?" I asked casually, looking up from my book. "Yeah, fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a little hiccup with the bank. Nothing to worry about." I nodded, feigning ignorance. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as though she was trying to read me, but I gave her nothing, just a calm, steady gaze that betrayed none of the storm raging inside me. A few days later, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "We've found enough evidence to prove intent," my lawyer said. "You're in a strong position to take this to court if needed. How do you want to proceed?" I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on me. Part of me wanted to confront Sophia immediately, to throw her betrayal in her face and demand answers. But I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. If I wanted to protect myself and my family's legacy, I had to stay focused. "Let's wait a little longer," I said. "I want to see how far she's willing to go." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place later that week. I discovered an email Sophia had sent to someone I didn't recognize, a so-called advisor who was clearly helping her orchestrate the plan. The email was explicit, detailing her intentions to claim the inheritance and leave me with nothing. My chest tightened as I read her words, each one a knife twisting deeper into my heart. That night, I couldn't even look at her. She sat across from me at the dinner table, laughing about some story she'd read online, while I silently planned the confrontation that would change everything. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every interaction with Sophia felt like a performance, her playing the doting wife, me pretending I didn't know the truth. But I couldn't wait any longer. The time had come to confront her and put an end to her schemes. That evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I walked in and set a folder on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up, confused. "What's this?" she asked, her voice light but tinged with suspicion. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Take a look." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the folder. "What's this about?" "Just some things I thought you might find interesting," I replied, sitting down across from her. Her smile faltered as she opened the folder and began flipping through the contents. Inside were copies of the documents she'd tried to have me sign, printouts of her emails to her so-called advisor, and screenshots of her browser history. Each page was a damning piece of evidence, and with every passing second, the color drained from her face. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why do you have these?" "You tell me," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been planning to steal my inheritance and leave me with nothing." Her eyes darted back and forth between the papers and me, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice shaking. I was just trying to help us manage things better." "Really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because your emails don't sound like someone trying to help. They sound like someone planning a heist." She stood up abruptly, the folder slipping from her hands. "How dare you accuse me of this? I've done nothing but love you and support you." "Love?" I said, my voice sharp. "Don't insult me, Sophia. I heard you on the phone. I read your emails. You were never in this for love. You were in this for the money." Her face twisted with anger, and for the first time, the mask she'd worn so carefully began to crack. "Fine," she snapped. "You want the truth? Yes, I was planning to leave. And yes, I wanted the money. But can you blame me? You're so gullible, so trusting. It was almost too easy." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I took a deep breath and stood up, meeting her glare with a calm, steady gaze. "Well, Sophia," I said evenly, "I hope you enjoyed playing your little game. Because it's over now. The accounts are frozen. The money is secure. and I have enough evidence to make sure you don't see a single cent of it." Her eyes widened in panic. "You can't do that," she shouted. "You can't just take everything from me." "Actually, I can," I replied, "and I already have." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, she looked truly defeated. "You've lost, Sophia," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You thought you could take everything from me, but in the end, you've only destroyed yourself." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression a mix of rage and disbelief. Then, without another word, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I sat down heavily on the couch, my hands trembling. The confrontation was over, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a boulder. Sophia had betrayed me in ways I never thought possible, but I had won. I'd protected my family's legacy, and more importantly, I'd taken back control of my life. The house was eerily quiet after Sophia stormed out, but the tension still hung in the air. I sat on the couch, staring at the folder of evidence that had shattered the facade of our marriage. My mind raced with everything she'd said, her cold confession, her cruel words about how I was too trusting. It was like I didn't even know the person I'd been married to. The next morning, I woke up to find Sophia's side of the bed empty, her belongings scattered in disarray. She was still in the house but avoided me entirely, slamming doors and pacing the hallways like a caged animal. It was clear she wasn't going to go quietly, and I needed to prepare for whatever came next. I called my lawyer to update him. "She knows now," I said. "She's furious, and I don't think she's going to let this go easily." "Stay calm," he replied. "You've done everything right so far. The accounts are secure, and the evidence is solid. If she tries to take legal action, we're ready." But Sophia didn't go straight to legal action. Instead, she tried another tactic, playing the victim. That afternoon, I found her sitting in the living room, her face tear-streaked, clutching an old photo of us from our wedding day. When she saw me, she sobbed dramatically. "How did we end up here?" she asked, her voice trembling. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to respond with anger. "You tell me, Sophia," I said evenly. "You're the one who planned all of this." "I made a mistake," she cried, dropping the photo onto the coffee table. "I got caught up in things, but I never stopped loving you." "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't try to manipulate me again. I know exactly what you were doing, and I'm not falling for it this time." Her tears dried up almost instantly, replaced by a hard, calculating look. "Fine," she said, her voice icy. "But you're not going to come out of this unscathed either. Do you think anyone will believe your version of events? You'll look like the villain, not me." I shook my head, refusing to let her threats get under my skin. "I have the truth on my side, Sophia. That's all I need." She didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't done fighting. Over the next few days, Sophia tried to spin the situation in her favor. She reached out to friends and family, painting herself as the innocent, wronged wife. I started getting calls from people who'd heard her version of events, claims that I was controlling, that I'd frozen the accounts out of spite, and that I was trying to leave her with nothing. At first, I felt a pang of doubt. What if people believed her lies? But then, one by one, the truth began to surface. My lawyer had advised me to quietly share the evidence with key people in our circle. Those who mattered most, like my family and close friends. The emails, the transfer forms, and even the recordings of her phone calls painted a clear picture of her deception. The backlash was swift. Those who had initially sided with her quickly distanced themselves, realizing the extent of her betrayal. Sophia's carefully constructed image began to crumble, and she found herself increasingly isolated. One evening I came home to find her packing her things. Suitcases were piled by the door, and her expression was a mix of anger and desperation. "You win," she said bitterly as I stepped inside. "I hope you're happy." "This was never about winning, Sophia," I said calmly. "This was about protecting what my family built and not letting you destroy it." She scoffed, zipping up her final bag. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Well, enjoy your lonely life because no one will ever trust you again." "Trust?" I said, shaking my head. "That's rich, coming from you." Without another word, she grabbed her bags and left, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house, leaving me alone with the silence once again. The days that followed were a mix of relief and sadness. On one hand, I felt free for the first time in months, unburdened by the lies and manipulation that had poisoned my marriage. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the pain of betrayal. Sophia had been someone I trusted with my heart, someone I'd imagined a future with, and now she was nothing more than a painful memory. But I refused to let her actions define me. I threw myself into rebuilding my life, reconnecting with family and friends who had supported me through everything. Slowly but surely, I began to heal. The house felt empty after Sophia left, but for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence wasn't suffocating, it was peaceful. I walked through each room, taking in the space I had once shared with someone I thought I knew. Now it was mine again, a blank canvas to rebuild my life on my own terms. The first thing I did was reconnect with the people who mattered most. My family, who had always been there for me, even when I was too blinded by love to see it, welcomed me back with open arms. My mother, who had been skeptical of Sophia from the start, didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, she hugged me tightly and said, "I'm glad you're okay. That's all that matters." Reaching out to my closest friends was harder. Sophia had poisoned so many of those relationships with her lies, and I wasn't sure if they'd believe my side of the story. But when I sat down with them and shared the truth, the evidence I'd uncovered, the schemes she'd planned, they were stunned. "We had no idea," one of them admitted. "She was so convincing." "She was," I said, nodding, "but I let myself believe the lie because it was easier than facing the truth. That's on me." They reassured me that I wasn't to blame, but part of me still felt the sting of guilt. How had I let this happen? How had I ignored the warning signs for so long? The hardest part of moving on was reclaiming my sense of self. Sophia's betrayal had shaken me to my core, leaving me questioning my judgment, my worth, and my ability to trust again. For weeks, I replayed every moment of our relationship in my head, searching for the exact point where everything had gone wrong. But then I realized something. Dwelling on the past wasn't going to change it. What mattered now was how I chose to move forward. I threw myself into my work, using the structure and focus to regain my confidence. I also took time to reflect on what I truly wanted for my future. Not the one Sophia had tried to manipulate me into, but the one I could build for myself. I started volunteering at a local charity my father had been passionate about, honoring his memory in a way that felt meaningful. It was there that I began to feel a sense of purpose again, connecting with people who valued authenticity and kindness. One afternoon, while organizing some files at home, I received a message from an unknown number. The moment I read it, my stomach dropped. "I hope you're happy. You destroyed me," the message read. It was from Sophia. For a moment I considered ignoring it. She didn't deserve my time or attention, but something about her words stuck with me. Destroyed her? No, she had destroyed herself. I replied with a single sentence, "You made your choices, Sophia, and so did I." Her response came almost immediately, a flurry of accusations and bitterness. But I didn't read the rest. I deleted the conversation and blocked her number. She no longer had power over me, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into her web of manipulation. As the weeks turned into months, the pieces of my life slowly began to fall into place. I redecorated the house, removing every trace of Sophia's influence and making it a space that felt entirely my own. I started spending more time with the people who mattered, repairing relationships that had been strained by Sophia's lies. One day, while cleaning out an old storage box, I found a letter from my father. It was one I'd forgotten about, written to me years ago before he passed. In it, he talked about the importance of integrity, kindness, and staying true to oneself. "Don't let the world harden you," he had written. "Even when people hurt you, remember that their actions don't define you. Your response does." Those words stayed with me, a reminder that I didn't have to let Sophia's betrayal shape my future. I could choose to move forward with strength and grace, rebuilding my life on a foundation of honesty and love. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Sophia was gone, but so were the lies and manipulation that had poisoned my life. In their place was something much more valuable: freedom. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, and I had come out stronger on the other side. As time went on, the sting of betrayal began to fade, replaced by clarity. Looking back, I realized that Sophia hadn't just taken advantage of my trust, she had taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Trust is precious, and while it should be given freely to those who deserve it, it should never be blind. For weeks, I reflected on everything I had overlooked: the subtle manipulation, the gaslighting, the way she had isolated me from people who could have helped me see the truth sooner. But instead of dwelling on the mistakes, I chose to focus on the growth. I was determined not to let her actions define me or poison my ability to connect with others. One of the first steps in this journey was forgiving myself. I had been kind and trusting, and while Sophia had taken advantage of those traits, they weren't flaws, they were strengths. I just needed to learn how to protect them better. With Sophia out of my life, I began to rebuild my social connections. Friends who had once pulled away, unsure of what to believe, reached out with apologies and support. I didn't blame them for their initial hesitation. Sophia had been a master manipulator. Many people had faced similar betrayals and were working to rebuild their lives. One day, while attending a charity event, I met someone who would change my perspective on trust and relationships entirely. Her name was Claire, and she had been volunteering at the same organization I had joined to honor my father's legacy. Claire was different from Sophia in every way. Where Sophia had been calculating and performative, Claire was warm and genuine. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did share, her words were thoughtful and sincere. At first I was cautious. My experience with Sophia had left me wary of new connections, especially romantic ones, but Claire was patient, never pushing me to open up before I was ready. Over time, we became friends, bonding over our shared commitment to the charity and our mutual love of books and travel. Slowly, my walls began to come down, and I found myself smiling more often, laughing more freely. Sophia's shadow lingered in my life for a while, mostly through mutual acquaintances who occasionally mentioned her in passing. I learned that she had tried to start over, but her reputation had followed her. The truth about her actions had spread, making it difficult for her to maintain the facade she had once relied on. One day I received a letter from her. It was short and filled with vague apologies, but it was clear she hadn't truly changed. She blamed her actions on circumstances, on stress, on anything but herself. I didn't respond. Sophia was a part of my past, and that's where she would stay. Instead, I focused on my present and future. With Claire's encouragement, I started a blog to share my experiences and lessons learned, hoping to help others navigate their own challenges with trust and betrayal. The response was overwhelming, with people from all over the world sharing their stories and thanking me for my honesty. One evening, as Claire and I sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how far I had come. I wasn't the same person I had been when I met Sophia. I was stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. I never thought I'd get here, I admitted, glancing at Claire. You've worked hard for it, she said, her voice steady, and you deserve it. For the first time in years, I believed her. This chapter of my life had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I had learned the value of boundaries, the importance of trusting my instincts, and the strength that comes from rebuilding after loss. As I looked at Claire, at the life I had started to create for myself, I felt a sense of peace. The betrayal that had once defined me was now just a part of my story, a story of resilience, growth, and hope. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what the future held.